our friends and our guests, Simon Rose of Save Our Savers and Jen Scoyles of the Real Asset Company.
What about Plucky the Rubber Chicken?
You're responsible for him. You're supposed to bring him.
I know. He was a great hit at Kilconomics this year, and Plucky has become a bit of a diva.
I see Simon has something with him.
What's this? Who's that?
A little monkey.
Simon has a little monkey with him, so you might meet him. Now, we've asked on maxkeiser.com, on Twitter, on RT's Google Plus page, on our Facebook page, and there's only one Keiser Report Facebook page. It's the official one. It's official. And we've asked the questions, and of course, guess what the number one question was? What topic was number one, Max?
Is it about Plucky?
No, it was about Bitcoin. Everybody wants to know about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, so I know, Jan, you've been writing about that on the Real Asset Company blog, and I hope, Simon, you might have an opinion about this as well. So let's ask the first question, because it's a very broad question about cryptocurrencies, and it's a good one to introduce everybody to the topic. So this is from Joseph Thompson, and he asked on RT's Google Plus page, he said, "Hey, Max and Stacy, keep up the great work. What part of cryptocurrencies do you find most fascinating? The social aspect, monetary aspect, etc. And secondly, Max, who is the first player you will buy when you take over Sheffield Wednesday Football Club?"
Oh, right. Well, is that for me?
Yeah, so which aspect of cryptocurrencies do you find most interesting? The monetary, fiscal, payment system, social aspect, what?
I think the social aspect, because it reminds me of when Napster started to go to war with the copyright cartel. And there's been an ongoing war between the copyright cartel and the lobbyists there, like the MPAA and the RIAA. And now we've got a currency going about the same path, using the same technology, and this time they're going after the Federal Reserve Bank system. And even now they're also merging with sites like Pirate Bay, are merging with cryptocurrencies. And this is very interesting to me on the social level. That's what I love about Bitcoin.
Okay, so then let's go to Jen Scoyles of the Real Asset Company, because Jen, you've been writing about Bitcoin for a while, one of the first of the gold and silver sort of sites that have been discussing Bitcoin. So what is the most fascinating to you observing as a person involved in gold and silver? What interests you most about Bitcoin?
I think that I agree with Max of the more social side of things that are going on at the moment. They, like Max was talking about Napster, I think also in this move sort of outside of the global financial crisis, we see more businesses being set up, which, you know, peer-to-peer businesses and people interacting outside of this organized system, whether it's the banking system, you know, whether it's insurance, different exchanges are being set up, you know, very similar sites like Airbnb. It's all to do with the social side of things, and I think that's where Bitcoin is why Bitcoin's doing very well, because we've realised that now the internet has facilitated us to do things peer-to-peer rather than going through this sort of upper external body, as it were. I like it from someone that's into sound money and interested in gold and silver, because again, gold and silver are faceless currencies. They can't be you know, reproduced by a central bank, and again we're seeing that with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And I think I also like it because, you know, in the words of a very famous commentator in this space, you should be your own central bank, and you should dictate how you're going to save and hold your money. And Bitcoin is just another way of protesting against how central banks are behaving, and that's why I'm interested in it. And I've said this many times. I think I've said it on Max's program as well. What someone once said to me when I first got involved in this space, I don't know what the right money is, but whichever one is the right money is the one that the people chose. And if that's happening with cryptocurrencies, it's happening with gold, if it's happening with silver, then, you know, job done. They're saying what they want money to be, and that's why it interests me at the moment.
Okay, and we'll ask Simon, and just keep on that idea for a moment there, Jen, because other people were asking, there seem to be so many cryptocurrencies emerging, so which one do you think will survive? I think you kind of answered that, but let's go over to Simon.
Well, I'm fascinated, but mainly as an observer. I mean, obviously, you know, representing a body of savers, we're appalled at the way the central bankers debase our currencies all the time. So any alternative which takes the power away from central bankers has to be admirable. The problem I have is that, as you tweeted the other day, Jan, I'm one of the guys who's terribly envious, because after listening to you a while ago, I spent a whole evening trying to buy some Bitcoins and getting into it, and I just failed completely. I need to do it again, quite clearly, at some stage. But I just found it, I'm not completely stupid as a techie, but I just found it completely beyond me, and I fell at the last hurdle after arranging to buy some because my bank wouldn't then let me transfer the money for several days, which of course defeated the object.
Yeah, that's actually a big problem we see at the moment. Is there people are sort of irrational with envy and rage about this, about how much the price has gone up. Now, Max, do you think this is a problem though? Some people like Hugh Hendry, a very well-known hedge fund manager here in the UK, has just come out and said it could be $1 million per Bitcoin. Merrill Lynch, remarkably, a top tech commentator there, top analyst at Merrill Lynch, just came out on Friday and said that Bitcoin is legitimate. It's going to displace Western Union. And he also brought up silver, which I think he probably got from us, is he compares it to silver, and that if it gains the legitimacy of silver, then it's surely at $1,300 is a fair value, he said. But what do you think about the price and what this means? And a lot of people say, oh, it's too expensive to buy.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, on CoinDesk, which is a good site that covers Bitcoin, they had a story today about a company here in the UK called ZipZap, which will have through 28,000 outlets around the UK the ability to go in and get Bitcoin, swap your pounds for Bitcoin. So it'll be a very retail product. I think that's what people miss about Bitcoin right now, is that you have to go back to 1994 and where the internet was back in 1994. A lot of people didn't think that the internet had any practical value. A lot of people found it too difficult to surf the internet, and it was not really that well understood or that well used. And then Netscape came along. It became a browser that was quite easy then to surf the web, and you have the enormous growth in what we now know as the internet. So Bitcoin is kind of in that 1994, 1995 period. A couple of companies and applications are coming along that will make it very easy to use, and people can get Bitcoin quite easily. The price continues to go higher. The Merrill Lynch comment, I think, is interesting because Bitcoin is generating a lot of content and a lot of interest. So firms like Merrill Lynch or business outlets in the media like Business Insider, for example, that had a huge reversal. 2 weeks ago they were completely anti-Bitcoin. Now they're fanatically supporting Bitcoin because there's a huge amount of traffic being generated both on the content side and on the monetary side, and Merrill Lynch or Business Insider cannot afford not to have a piece of that traffic. Same thing with Hugh Hendry. He cannot afford not to be in Bitcoin or think about Bitcoin and still be competitive. And
Jan, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think it's interesting at the moment, people that, well, first of all, I'd quite like to go back to that envy thing, because I think that was quite interesting, because we saw that particularly with gold, a lot of people getting very angry about gold, and that was heading towards 1900. And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's clearly, it's worthless, and they were just angry about missing out on it. Well, I think we're seeing the same with Bitcoin, but you can't deny that more and more these huge industries, the banking industry, the governments, they're all coming out having to make comments on it, and it's because, like Max says, they can't afford to not be commenting on it. They can't afford to not be paying attention to it. We've now, China this week was the other big news, and they were having to respond to it as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more and what that means for Bitcoin. But certainly we're seeing, and the more people that are demanding to pay for things in Bitcoin, it can't be ignored. You can't ignore this conversation that's going on. And again, it comes down to this peer-to-peer thing. If we're talking to one another and we can make it happen without these people, then they either start listening to us or, they don't get to play the game, And I think Simon's got something he wants to say.
Well, I really want to ask you all a question. I mean, the big worry when you look back at what happened to gold in 1931, confiscation by the American government, is when the authorities finally get worried about Bitcoin, as clearly they must be sooner or later, how safe is it from any appropriation by the authorities?
Well, we've been asked this a lot lately. A few things, of course, the authorities don't like BitTorrents, but you can get any single movie, any single television show right now on Pirate Bay, which they are unable to shut down. And if they can't shut down these BitTorrents, this is the thing, it's peer-to-peer, it's crypto, and it's a lot of money. So you're asking I think it's the equivalent of like when Mubarak tried to turn off the internet in Egypt, and it only lasted a few days before even all his thug buddies who ran corporations and the businesses, they demanded that it have to be turned back on because their businesses collapsed. So they want a piece.
So this really is sticking it to the man.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think, Max?
No, I think the BitTorrent is a good analogy, and Pirate Bay and the BitTorrent infrastructure and ecosystem continues really despite all the efforts of governments and lobbyists. And the Bitcoin strengthens both BitTorrent and Pirate Bay, which in turn strengthens Bitcoin, because a lot of people say, what am I going to spend my Bitcoin on? Well, more and more it's going to be on micropayments for things like BitTorrents and other sites. Or we saw an application in the journalism space and the political space with the Julian Assange case. Of course, when people try to give Julian Assange some money, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard created a financial blockade. Bitcoin was the only way to get money into the WikiLeaks and to support Julian Assange. So again, there's this huge network of folks all over the world. So any one country or a few companies may take an anti-Bitcoin position, but they're never going to equal the global support of Bitcoin. And as the global support continues in places like Africa, Asia, India, there's no single entity, whether it's a corporation or a country, that's going to be able to stop it.
Okay.
Yeah, and Simon, what do you think about the example for like displacing Western Union? Now, a lot of people are very angry and jealous, as you admitted yourself, about the price going up like that. And it is quite difficult to buy, partly because of the regulatory confusion. It used to be easier about 3 years ago, and that's why we have all these Bitcoin billionaires now, is because it was easier back then to buy it. And then once banks started shutting down, the too big to fail banks started shutting down the bank accounts of these exchanges, I think it became a little bit more difficult. But it now is being used in like displacing Western Union and money transfers. And if you compare it to the likes of Twitter or Facebook, a lot of people get angry about the original investors, people who have Bitcoin from years ago, and they're somehow, to them, this seems unfair.
I'm not angry. I'm just envious that I wasn't as far-sighted as you two.
Well, some people get angry thinking that means it's a Ponzi scheme. But all the early investors, it was a huge risk. By the way, it could have evaporated in an instant. Yeah. So those people were taking huge risks with. Okay, it might have only been $100 that then turned into $20,000 or $30,000, but it was still a risk that you were going to lose that $100. And the same people who took the initial risks on Facebook or Twitter or any of these other internet companies, they took risks. And the Twitter investors, the original guys, might have put in $100, and now they have $1 million or $1 billion.
I do feel sorry for the guy who's been searching on that Welsh rubbish tip for his hard drive. I imagine he never found it, but that's such a sad story.
Well, to tell you the truth, it is quite difficult it's quite easy, I say, to lose it, especially back then. I have multiple wallets, and I did lose some back in the day because, it was like, oh, it's only 10 Bitcoin in there or only 20 Bitcoin, and that was like $50. Or, at one point it was like $50, and I was like, oh, well. So then it like disappears, and it's worth $30,000, and you're like, wait. Tearing apart all my old computers. Where's that wallet? So, now, Jan, this question's for you, okay? And this is about, because everybody's asking, have we forgot about silver? And a question from Nikhil Kripalani on Facebook. She asks, silver, what and when? Then I've been warming ounces since a long time ago. I hope a little of the Bitcoin rubs off on it.
Well, I certainly haven't forgotten about it, and I'm sure you and Max haven't forgotten about it. And also, I don't think most of the clients at the real asset company have forgotten about it. In the past couple of months, we've seen more demand for silver than we have for gold, which is interesting. That when question, I was doing something like this last week, and someone asked the magic when question, and once again, I've forgotten my crystal ball. Who knows when it's going to take off? Max might have more of an idea. I think there's still issues, over manipulation. There's all the all the things that should be driving gold and silver higher at the moment aren't helping gold and silver. And I think just it's facing this correction. I think it's still going to go lower. And I think people are asking when, and am I going to jump back in at the right time? And I said this a couple of weeks ago, that even when the correction happened back in the 1970s, people didn't miss. Even if you got in a year later, you still, made huge returns on it. So people shouldn't worry about jumping in at the wrong time. And I think the other thing to note back on silver is that the coins, the demand for coins we're seeing is still phenomenal compared to gold. Gold coin demand, I think last month was down quite significantly, but silver coin demand was only down 1%. People are still buying it. So there's still this huge physical demand. And I think, again, like with gold, we're just seeing this huge divergence in the demand for the two, in the nature of the demand, both, what's happening in the futures market, what's happening in physical. And again, the other thing that's interesting is silver ETF demand, hardly any outflows at all. So it's quite interesting what's happening. And I think, like you say, you've been keeping it warm. That's all you can do, keep nesting on it. And I know it's saying difficult, don't just, it's not just about the price, but we do say you're holding on to silver because it's a form of money, it's your savings. And I do believe that this correction is coming to an end, but I don't know when. But it's not costing you any more or anything, and you haven't lost any silver. And I think, like Jim Rickard says, you have these things for insurance purposes. You don't buy insurance because you expect to be burgled. You don't buy insurance because you expect your house to burn down. But you have insurance for that just in case, and that's why you're hanging on to silver and gold.
Okay, Simon, actually, so I know you're a saver, you're big on savings. Do you have any savings in silver or gold?
I have bought a little gold, yes, I confess. I was put off silver by the fact that you have to pay VAT on it, though I'm sure Jan can tell me how to avoid that. Yeah. But yeah, I got a little gold. And in fact, I think I'm a great contracyclical indicator. I think the moment I bought gold was when it started going down. So you should avoid whatever I buy.
Okay. Well,
can I just jump in on that VAT thing?
Oh yeah, sure. Because we do get asked that a lot by.
Yeah, and I talked about this I think back in April on your show. You don't pay VAT on the silver that you buy with us. So don't let that shouldn't put you off at all. And also don't believe what Simon says. You shouldn't buy what he's investing in because you should definitely invest in gold and silver.
But obviously.
What was that, Simon?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I represent a body of savers, and the one real problem, of course, is that cash savings in the UK and the US is just such an appalling thing to be doing at the moment from a strictly financial point of view, because they're just taking your money away the whole time by not controlling inflation.
But we've just come back onto the same point that I just made, and that you're right, they're taking your money away the whole time because of inflation and because there's negative interest rates. But when you've got gold and silver in storage, they're not taking that away.
Yeah.
So that's what you need to bear in mind.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, starting 2 years ago or so, one of the ways that we got people into Bitcoin was that we were talking about a hedge against the manipulation going on in gold and silver. Because there's a lot of money printing going on. You see art prices hitting historic highs. You see London real estate hitting historic highs. There's obviously lots of inflation in different areas of the economy. You don't see it in gold and silver because of the manipulation. So I was suggesting a year ago, 2 years ago, as a hedge against inflation, one way to hedge your gold and silver portfolio is to buy Bitcoin. And we've been talking about gold, silver, Bitcoin for 2 years now. The hedge happened to become the best performing asset in the world by several thousand percentage points. But initially it was an idea to hedge against manipulation. And this is something that Bitcoin offers, is that right? That there's no way that the same people that are keeping the price of gold and silver artificially low can do the same thing with Bitcoin.
I want to say, because I was at the London Bitcoin Expo last weekend, and it's truly remarkable what the number of people who approached me. Max isn't there. Everybody wanted to know where Max was, but everybody approached and said a wide range of people that had started companies based on watching Keiser report, and they were fascinated by the possibility of Bitcoin. None of them ever expected the price to go up like this. They had been looking at it as more of the social aspect of Bitcoin. And the number of companies, like such a wide range of them offering all sorts of services with Bitcoin, and people like one woman who came up to me and she had bought like 200 pounds worth of Bitcoin like 3 years ago, and now she has 19,000 pounds that she used for her to pay in full her university fees for her daughter. So that was quite fascinating to me.
It's fascinating, and presumably a great deal of this is people losing faith, not just in fiat currencies, but in official statistics. I noticed the Bank of England just today revealed their regular inflation survey, And the average Briton thinks inflation is running at twice the official level. Now, normally, it's not really that different, but people clearly are now beginning to actually feel their pocket being pinched by the authorities, and I think they're beginning to understand where the blame lies.
Yeah, and one of the things, during the initial financial collapse in 2008, there was a huge debate going on online between, it was mostly the hard money people. Jen, you'll remember this. It was between, is there inflation, deflation, or hyperinflation? Everybody was expecting hyperinflation, and in a way, I think Bitcoin is the hyperinflation, in that hyperinflation is really a political event. It's people lose faith in that currency, and this is people losing faith and sick and tired of the lies and the fraud and the bailing out, and even Satoshi Nakamoto in the original white paper releasing Bitcoin, he does mention the bailouts in the UK in particular.
Yeah, it was founded with those things in mind, for sure. And you see exactly pretty much what was predicted back then playing out today. That's
right. And by the way, you could tweet us, use the hashtag Keiser Hangout, or tweet me at Stacy Herbert. And I'm also looking at the Google Plus page. Now, Simon, you mentioned the inflation numbers at the bank, that people think inflation is twice, or they know inflation is at least twice as much as the Bank of England says. And now David Cameron has been in China, where he's struck a huge deal, of course, for the pig semen, to export pig semen to China. That I think that should help your economy here. But we had quite a few questions as well about China. So why don't you start, maybe if you have a thought on where do you see China versus U.S. relationship, and I guess also the UK 5 years from now. Do you see it as a real threat? A lot of people think it's the next empire, the next superpower, the next big economy. What do you think?
It's a little outside my area of expertise, but you can't help feeling that they're making some of the same mistakes that we are. Massive credit. I mean, a few years ago, you seemed to think China was going to be the great economic engine. But when you read some of the stuff that's happening with the banking system over there and the shadow banking system, I begin to worry that it may just be yet another possible source of implosion.
Yeah. Now, and I want to ask Jan, because I know, Jan, that you've been looking at the actual. We're kind of losing Jan. Your head is going further and further down.
Daisy.
Yeah. You have to sit up a little bit higher. Can you tell us what the numbers are, what you know from gold going to China? And if they're buying that much gold, what are they thinking? What is the government, what is the central bank there thinking? Are they thinking of themselves as a next superpower, as a next big economic power?
Well, I think what country doesn't hope to be the next superpower, the next economic power? And I think, China, in terms of what it's doing, in terms of buying up resources, what it's doing with its financial system, with gold, it's facilitating personal gold, individual gold ownership. In terms of how much is going into China, the official predictions are that if it will import, or it has imported already over 1,000 tons this year alone. But actually, that's only looking at Hong Kong import numbers, and so there are obviously other means of getting gold, and they also mine gold, so it could be up to 2,000 tons. So we can look at all the official numbers all we like, but then it's always worth speculating on those numbers as well. Why they're doing this, I've just said, I think it's again, I talked about this on the show when the gold was taken from China many years ago, and I think there's been this kind of, we talked about this kind of intrinsic feeling within people in order to get it back, and I think that's happening in China, and they're working to build up their gold reserves. I think they've learnt their lessons in the past in terms of paper money. They're now sort of reducing the levels of US debt, and also I was reading an interesting thing about how China are actually sort of slowly buying up parts of factories in Detroit, to build up an automobile industry. So I think they are kind of putting planters down in order to carry on this global superpower, and they're also interesting trade relationships not involving the US dollar. So I see absolutely no reason why that isn't what's going ahead. Like Simon says, though, it does look pretty risky in terms of the banking system and the shadow banking system, but they are making some sensible moves in terms of goals, and and also it's not just gold that's big in China, everything's big in terms of what they're mining and what they're importing.
It's also worth remembering, we just did speak to Steve Keen for the Keiser report, that in China, all that leverage is with the banks and corporations, whereas in the UK, which has record levels of debt for personal household debt. Now, somebody, Max, Sarah Butterlips on Facebook.
Mrs. Butterworth? Is that a cousin of Mrs. Butterworth, the pancake woman?
Butterlips.
Butterlips.
She asked, I read last night that China's renminbi has taken over the euro and is now second place, just below the dollar in global trade. What do you think about this? Now, just to put that into context, however, the U.S. dollar is still at like 82% of global trade, and now China's renminbi is something like 10%. So it's taken over the euro, which is about, I think, like in the 6 or 7% range.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dollar was 80% or higher maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It's been steadily shrinking. I think it's trying to hold on to the 70% level. It might be down to the 66% level. So the dollar, in terms of world reserve currency and use in global transactions, is lessening every quarter, every year. It's being replaced by these other currencies. So obviously, with the Chinese currency is now taken over in terms of the euro trade. It's just part and parcel of this trend as we head to a multipolar world of currency influence from Asia, the U.S., and Europe. And this is going to be the story going forward. That's why it's very interesting to look at what's happening in the UK, because there's a debate whether they should be in the euro or out of the euro. And of course, people want the UK to jump out of the euro, but that would make the British pound, really a pariah currency in many ways. And they would lose in enormous economies of scale with that move. I don't think they really understand what's going on in the global currency markets.
Well, let's move on, actually, because we were talking about the economy in China and then here, and let's move on to the matters of economics. So this is a question on maxkeiser.com from Matt. And Simon, this is going to be good for you as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts on pegging the minimum wage to the money supply. How would it work? This is an idea that Max Keiser had come up with on an episode of the Keiser Report a year or 2 or 3 years ago. Also, why would it work? When you mentioned it a few months back, I thought it was an interesting idea, and I haven't been able to really find good information on it because it's all right up here.
Why asking Simon that question?
No, Simon will have an opinion on it.
Why ask me that question?
It's
my idea. Why are you asking Simon?
It's a question for you, and I said, Simon, pay attention to this.
I am paying attention.
He'll have a follow-up.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, answer.
Well, as I have said, you have an interesting split in how the bankers are paid versus everybody else, because bankers are paid basically in terms of how quickly the money supply is increasing, because the money supply is increasing and therefore banking business goes up because they can package all of the debt that's based on that expansion in the money supply, and then they get these huge bonuses based on all the debt that they've created. So their pay is really tied to money supply. Then on the other side of the coin, you have workers who are tying their wages to something called inflation. As Simon has already said, inflation is understated by at least 50 to 60% here in the UK. So you have workers saying, oh, I want my wages to keep up with inflation. Well, first of all, the wages are not even keeping up with the low inflation numbers that are being reported now. The wages are increasing in this country less than 1% a year. The official inflation number is about 3% a year. The unofficial inflation is between 6 and 9% a year. So it's foolish for workers to try to tie their wages to the official inflation rate, and when they're competing with bankers who are tying their wages to the money supply rate, which is expanding almost exponentially. So either A, pay bankers tied to these fake inflation numbers, or B, pay workers tied to the money supply. But you can't have workers being paid based on made-up numbers that are being pulled out of, Mark Carney's hat. And then you have another group in society, the bankers, who are being paid based on a completely different set of numbers. So that's just not right.
Well, Simon, I want to ask you your opinion on that, but also put it into the context of the latest, the ONS numbers that showed that the median income is down £5,000 in the past 5 years, and the savings drawdown is at the worst in 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, it looks as if average disposable income in the UK is about at a 10-year low. I mean, it's the same in the States. People are getting and feeling poorer all the time. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, the actual numbers go up. So because things are denominated in a declining currency, I think people think it's the rapacious supermarkets. They never seem to think that it's Carney's fault or Mervyn King's fault or the Chancellor's fault. I still don't see why we actually have to have 2% inflation every year as a target. Why actually decide you're going to debase your currency all the time? But the problem is people are falling behind. And eventually, we've discussed this before, Max, eventually, surely this anger is going to start making itself felt. It does worry me just how supine people are and how they seem to shrug their shoulders and think it's the natural order of things. Well, as we know, anybody who watches the Keiser report knows it's not natural at all. It's completely manipulated and distorted for the benefit of a few.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned that people are struggling, and they are going deeper into debt, and part of that it then incentivizes them to want lower interest rates, not realizing that the debasement of the currency is making it harder for them. And house prices, they're going up. I mean, the latest number I just saw today in the headlines is up 7.7% across the UK. Of course, most of that is in London. But
no, and they say I think it's slightly exaggerated, perhaps, but that's 10%. 10 times faster than the increase in wages. How sustainable is that? I mean, it's utterly crazy. You mentioned before about savings. We saw this week that we've had the sharpest drop in 40 years or so in long-term savings. Now, it was reported wrongly in the press. Everybody said it's a complete fall in savings. Actually, the amount in cash savings in the UK has gone up 4% in the last year. There's still about 1.2 trillion pounds in cash savings, whereas household debt is 1.4 trillion. But what I thought was quite interesting, of all the things we've seen recently, McKinsey did a report. Of course, they were the ones who pointed out just how indebted the UK was relatively recently. But they did a report about low interest rates and QE and the effect on different economies. And what was fascinating is every time we as savers say we need interest rates to be higher, I mean, not only for self-interest, but because it helps avoid the malinvestment, it helps avoid zombie companies, it means the banks have got to be honest about what's on their books, so many reasons. But everybody always says, oh yeah, but the people who borrowed, they're going to be in such trouble. Well, according to McKinsey's numbers, UK households actually have lost 120 billion more through low interest rates than they have gained through any benefit on loans. And which group has benefited almost exactly the same amount? 110 billion pounds benefit has gone to the UK government. How incredibly convenient that they almost match out.
I think Max has a response to this.
Oh yeah, well, Simon has been on our show a few times. We're talking about this, how the gain in house prices doesn't really offset the loss in the economy overall through the loss that is associated with these low interest rates that have stoked this housing bubble. But what's really tragic about this housing bubble in the UK is that the people who are making the loans for these houses, that being the banks, they're completely hedged when house prices go down. Either they get bailed out by the government, as they did last time, or they put on financial hedges. So they have a whole portfolio of mortgages that they've made to fuel the speculation, and that portfolio is hedged in the financial markets using derivatives and other ways to hedge that portfolio. So they have no real risk to the loans that they're making. But the average person borrowing the money and speculating on that house, when house prices collapse, as they of course will, it's 100% guaranteed we'll have another housing collapse here in the UK. When they collapse, these people have no hedge. They're just going to take it full on in the teeth, 100% wipeout. They'll be in negative equity again. They have no hedge going into it. The government didn't tell them to protect themselves. The media outlets here in the UK did not tell them how to protect themselves, and they're assuming all of the risk, and it's a tragedy.
Well, not only that they're not being told by the government to protect themselves, the government is encouraging people to take on mortgages at the moment without really explaining that interest rates might actually go up, and of course with Help to Buy, the taxpayers on the hook as well if things go wrong. Great system, guys. They're obviously hoping they'll get re-elected. I mean, it's such blatant electioneering, hoping that people will feel fuzzy and warm because house prices are going up and vote for them. I think people
Simon,
may be
you
a bit
don't feel
bright.
fuzzy and warm? I know you own your home there, but you don't feel all fuzzy and
Me?
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
glad to say no longer a mortgage, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not warm. I'm a saver, so I don't even keep the heating on during the day.
Okay, Jan, your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I'm sort of just merely just want to comment on it from a kind of not so much an economist perspective, but I'm at the other end of the spectrum to Simon in that at the moment, how things stand, I'll never be able to afford to buy a house. You know, not just in the UK, but you know where I want to buy a house here in London. And you know, like Simon was just saying, I just feel this is a complete preying on the weak, as it were, by the government and by the banks, because they know, and you know, I think you guys have often commented about this on your show. The UK, British citizens are a nation of home owners. We have it kind of, it's been built in our mindset for a very long time that we must own a home, that it's a secure thing to do, and that's quite a difference to the rest of Europe. And I don't know if it goes all the way back to, you know, you weren't allowed to vote, and you know, unless you owned a home all those many years ago. But it is something that's built into us. And I think, like, you know, we were just saying about interest rates and inflation, people do feel like they're not getting any wealth anywhere else. You know, they're certainly not getting in their savings accounts or ISAs or whatever else. And so they see a house and they think, well, I can be living in it, and oh look, house prices are going up, so that's where my wealth is, and that's guaranteed. And the government are just encouraging it. You know, it's like Simon was saying, this Help to Buy scheme is just, it's really frightening. And I've got so many friends that have jumped in and have, you know, gone for it because they just sort of, they don't see an option, and they're like, oh, but it's guaranteed by the government. You just think, yeah, well, everything's guaranteed by the government apparently. You know, and like Max says, you know, this housing crisis that's coming, it's quite terrifying. But I think it's almost, for me, I kind of almost relieved that the house prices are too high, so that I'm not tempted to get in, you know, and have a go and hope that it's a worthwhile punt. Sorry, Simon, go on.
No, I was simply going to say, I just remember my parents telling me that when they bought their first house, you expected to make a loss. You bought it as somewhere to live in. Now, there's an extraordinary idea. You didn't buy it as an investment. And I was very lucky. I mean, I was about, I guess, Jan's age when I bought my first place, and I pushed the boat out a little, but nothing like people have to do now. Well, you're going to have a whole generation of young professionals, apart from anything else, who simply are not going to be able to afford to live in their own homes. Now, in a rational environment, because London is so expensive, people move elsewhere, but we're not as mobile, I think, as the Americans tend to be.
Okay, now next question is, we'll start with Max on this, because it goes along with all this, because house prices, of course, are very cheap in Detroit, where you could buy a home for like 50 bucks, 50 quid, which is cheaper than a dinner out in Soho. Now, however, the Detroit bankruptcy got the go-ahead this week to go bankrupt as a huge municipal bankruptcy, and it looks like they're going to target the pensions of the city employees, where they're on an average of $19,000 before you start commenting on the YouTube below and say, oh, they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not California. This is Detroit, and they're on an average of $19,000 pension. Now, that's going to be slashed. I saw one police officer, former police officer, saying that it was going to get cut down to like $6,000 from $19,000. So the question is from John Rutkowski on Facebook. Do you think this is going to be something that is going to spread across the entire U.S.?
Well, the bank's predatory behavior is going after either pots of money or predictable, reliable income streams. So in the housing market, they have what they believe to be predictable, reliable income streams. So they create these massive bubbles and busts as a way to take possession of people's homes. You see that in the United States now. The homes are owned by hedge funds and private equity groups who bought tens of thousands of homes after the last bust because they get that predictable income stream. In the case of money pots of money, Detroit had a pension system with a pot of money in it. So in order to grab that money, you allowed for the municipality to go bankrupt. It's very similar to what we see going on with Carl Icahn and Apple Computer. Apple Computer has a $100 billion plus pot of money, and Carl Icahn is a corporate raider who decided he was going to raid. He's raiding Apple to get that pot of money. We used to call it on Wall Street greenmail, which was a version of blackmail. But now in the 21st century, his activities are referred to as being an activist investor. So they've rebranded themselves in this warm, fuzzy way as being an activist investor. But they're actually just blackmailers and predatory agents, operators in the system. So whenever you see pots of money or predictable income, and in the UK, you have predictable income in the transportation system. So what happened? It went privatized and it was open to predatory monopolists. Same thing in the healthcare system with the NHS. Same thing with the student loans. Same thing with housing. Anything with predictable income, you have a predatory banking establishment with no regulatory oversight whatsoever. They're going to do whatever they can to grab that income, grab that money.
And actually, let's ask both of you about this and put it into relationship to what this latest TTIP and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Trans-Atlantic. There's a similar deal, but basically it's going to take all assets, national-owned assets or national assets, are now going to be open to these private corporations who actually, through these new deals being struck, will also have their own separate legal system whereby it has higher authority than your national ones. If either of you have any sort of comment on this, and like I know the Pope just came out today and condemned these two trade agreements. Do either of you have a comment about that? Because there were many questions about that.
I don't really have a comment on it. I think I just want to just jump back to the main Detroit thing. Is I think what scares me about Detroit is a lot of people, I think, you guys can probably correct me if I'm wrong because you speak to a lot more Americans than I do, but I think a lot of people think, oh, Detroit, they were silly and it's not going to happen to us or anything. And I think, and even in the UK, we've always looked down our noses a wee bit, generally at Americans, and I think, not me personally, obviously, but kind of general consensus. And I think the Detroit thing is just kind of, they've lost control and they overspent. And I think it's quite scary when you look at the numbers and the reasons why Detroit went the way it did, particularly in terms of their property taxes were so high and they were driving, they were sort of it wasn't attractive anymore to be there. It was too expensive for businesses to remain there, and wages and benefits and all the obligations on the local government. And I think that's something that we have to bear in mind for not only the UK economy but other US states. But in terms of the trade agreements, literally all I've done on that is kind of what you just mentioned, so I wouldn't be comfortable talking about that at the moment.
Okay, Simon, any thoughts on the
No,
pension?
I'm way behind the curve on this one. I obviously need to bone up.
How about the pensions? You know a lot about pensions, though, right?
Well, I thought the problem with pensions
here, I know that they're saying that we're going to have to start retiring at 70 plus here in the UK.
Yeah, well, to some extent that is sensible. If you have a steadily aging population, then a pension system that was established many years ago when people stood very little chance of actually living even to pensionable age, well, it does make sense to try and make some sort of attempt to match your obligations with what's going to happen. I do notice now that with the pensionable age going up to 70, as somebody pointed out to me only earlier today, that means that in Glasgow, many people won't actually get to their pensionable age because the age men are expected to live to in Glasgow is less than 70. But it's an unaffordable scheme.
Yeah.
It's a Ponzi scheme. It always has been in the UK. It's using the next generation to pay for the pensions of the previous generation. How long can that survive? I mean, we have a sort of pensions apartheid of sorts in the UK because we have about a sixth of the workers are in sort of state sponsored pensions, including, of course, our own MPs, and they have by and large a much more generous and guaranteed pension scheme. But if you're in the private sector, every single government in the UK has tinkered with pensions. They've stolen a bit here, stolen a bit there. And it's not only that pensions are less valuable than they used to be. We used to have a pension system that was the envy of the world in the private sector. It certainly isn't now. And the real problem is not just that they keep stealing bits of it and making it less attractive, but that they add this uncertainty all the time. And it's not only in pensions, it's in everything. My parents' day and when I bought a house, by and large, you sort of knew what things were going to be like in 5-10 years. You have trouble now knowing what the system's going to be like in 5 months, let alone 5 years.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in there? And I hate to bring this back to basics and kind of, be all self-righteous about things, but I think, this is my generation that we're talking about, that being told that we have to work until we're 70, and the question over pensions and everything. But actually, if this was going to happen to any generation and at any point, this is the best generation for it to happen to, because we're now at a point in time which we talked about right at the beginning of the power of the internet and what this can do in terms of social and peer-to-peer. And this is my generation, and I know, okay, other generations are also getting involved in Bitcoin, but we are able to jump on the Bitcoin things. Things aren't too late for us in terms of pensions, and we can start taking control of our own finances. I'm not only asking questions about the banking system and what's happening with the government, but we can just start avoiding the banking system and avoiding, what the government are doing. We can start protesting with our money. We're doing it early enough that the government can latch on and go, hang on, there's going to be a lot of money being earned by these people, but they're not putting it into our banking system. We're putting them elsewhere. And I think, yes, okay, people are moaning about the fact that the retirement age has been has been increased, but actually we're all living longer anyway and we're healthier, so I don't really see a huge argument in that. But what I do say is, okay, we'll get up and do something about it, learn how to invest your money sensibly, learn about the risks of the banking system, because of course this is one of the problems with the global financial crisis. Everyone said, oh, things are regulated, so I don't really need to ask any questions about the safety of my money in the banks or in any other kind of investment product. And one of the positives to hopefully come out of the financial crisis and the bailouts and everything else and what's happening in the UK economy at the moment in terms of inflation and this slow growth is that the people that it's not too late for, who are only just starting to think about savings, who maybe haven't even started thinking about their pensions yet, we can start going, okay, how can I protect my portfolio so that there is the most minimal counterparty risk possible on the money that I'm saving? And I think that's something that people really need to take away when they're thinking about pensions at the moment, whether it's in the UK or whether it's in Detroit, and start learning from the misunderstandings that happened before.
And Max, do you have anything to add to this, and including bail-ins and taking your confiscation of funds and reneging on obligations and promises?
Well, to pick up on the loss of faith in the banking system, 2 years ago there was a big campaign both in the United States and in the UK called Move Your Money. People said, get your money out of those money center banks. And they moved their money into what they believed to be ethical banks. Here in the UK, they moved it to Co-op Bank. Now, just a few months ago, or just recently, a few weeks ago, of course, Co-op Bank is involved in a major scandal. At the time, we were saying, this goes back a year and a half, if you're going to move your money, move it into gold, silver, and Bitcoin, because it makes no sense to rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. It makes no sense to move your money from Citibank or Barclays to Co-op, because there's really no difference at the end of the day. And sure enough, that's exactly what proved to be the case. As far as Cyprus and the bail-ins, that model of the government's confiscating wealth directly from people's savings accounts, I think we'll see more of that going forward. And so that's, again, something people should be protecting themselves against, because this is a wave of confiscation that is definitely coming.
One of the things we always used to say as well is about the bad thing about property, of course, is that when the governments get desperate, as they are in Detroit, is they go after the easiest money to get, and that will be your savings, your pension, and property. It's very hard to put your property in your backpack and cross the border and go somewhere else. So that's the thing they target. And I saw in the autumn statement, George Osborne is saying that he's going to go after overseas buyers. When they sell their properties here, there's a new tax coming in, a new capital gains tax. I think it's pretty remarkable that there was no capital gains tax for foreign buyers, but whatever. Do you have any comment about that new tax, Simon?
No, I mean, as you say, they go after the easy money, and one of the most extraordinary things in the last couple of years has been the influx of money, particularly from Europe, some from China as well, buying property in London, because it's seen as being a good hedge against instability elsewhere. I mean, there will be profits. I suppose if you have to pay tax on profits, there's still a profit there. But I mean, you're entirely right. They will go after the easy money. We saw the IMF recently, didn't we, suggest in a paper that perhaps bail-ins were going to be a great idea in future. I was amazed how little publicity that actually received, given how extraordinary an idea it is. But when the IMF itself is suggesting that as being a sensible policy move, you know that the system is really, really badly damaged. And it still just amazes me that people haven't recognized it more. But I still go back to what Jan was saying, that I think these cryptocurrencies, I mean, it does feel to me, and I don't really know, that one of the main reasons is because people are feeling they don't want to keep all their eggs in the rather fragile conventional banking system. They want an alternative to it, and gold, as I have found out, is not necessarily at the moment the best way of doing it.
Can I just jump on that capital gains tax thing? I don't know anything about capital gains tax, but actually I was reading Alistair Heath's column in City AM today. Can I just read a bit out? So it says that there were some misleading statements, as ever, in the autumn statement. The Chancellor has repeatedly and wrongly claimed that people who live overseas pay no CGT on their UK homes. That is at best a gross exaggeration and at worst a complete misleading nonsense designed to stir up animosity towards prosperous foreigners. And there are some countries in which when you make gains on your UK homes, you must pay capital gains tax. So it's not entirely...
Well, I think it's just for mostly Americans. Americans always
French, American, or German resident. If you make
yeah,
a gain,
yeah. Americans always have to pay tax no matter what, everywhere.
Can I leap in with something? I mean, we're talking about misleading things that George Osborne said yesterday. This is, if anybody's in the UK, they'll know we have this autumn statement, which is like a sort of semi-budget each year. And the whole impression was given that we're going back into the black because the deficit for the UK, how much we borrow each year, which when they came into power they said was going to be gone completely by the end of Parliament, which is 2015. They're now saying is going to be gone by the end of the next Parliament. But he kept saying we're going to be in the black. But if you actually look at the numbers, the UK government, which currently owns about £1.2 trillion, will be owing £1.5 trillion in 4 years' time, which is about the same as our GNP. I mean, that's hardly what I would call being back in the black.
Yeah, but Simon, isn't household debt 1.43 trillion?
Yes.
So
I mean, this is the worrying thing, and my name is Max, and you say time after time again, we have learned no lessons from the financial crisis. We have put almost nothing right. A house that was built on quicksand has started falling to pieces, and they took a couple of stories off, and instead of actually sorting out the foundations and getting rid of the quicksand, they've just started piling more stories on top of it again. It's still built on quicksand. I'm amazed that things have gone on as long as possible, but as somebody pointed out to me the other day, you thought the Soviet Union was going to self-destruct many years before it did. You're always amazed how long things can keep going. But I mean, I just don't believe a word that comes out of George Osborne's mouth anymore.
Well, if you want to see a good impression of George Osborne and David Cameron, Max did a good one today. Max, did you?
I started trying to watch it on the tube and then realized that probably wasn't the best place to see it.
Max, did you have any comments on that? And while Max is answering, I'm going to go look at the comments on the Google Hangout. So if you're there, I'm coming to look at you.
Right. Well, the debt, as Simon is pointing out, continues to go higher. And this is a continued problem that can only be solved by interest rates going higher, and either the market in the form of the gilt market or sovereign bond market reaches the point in which it cannot go up any higher and it will start to sink, as it does every secular bear market, or the Bank of England or other central banks take a more proactive approach and do what they should have been doing for the past 5 or 10 years, and that is to keep interest rates a little bit higher to curb this problem of malinvestment and overspeculation. So that is a box out of which Mark Carney or Janet Yellen or Mario Draghi will not be able to extricate themselves. Either they print money ad infinitum to the point where art prices triple again, gold and silver break the confines of the manipulation that's going on, and they trade up substantially. Bitcoin is already discounting this hyperinflation. Or B, they start to default on each other's debt with some kind of new global agreement on the currency grid and the exchange values of currencies, kind of a Bretton Woods approach, which would have enormous impact on the average British person and an American person in a very negative way, because you're going to go through a highly destructive series of defaults. So those are the only two outcomes. There is no middle ground really, and the proof of that is, as Simon is pointing out, just look at that debt number. If what George Osborne was saying was true, that number would not be going up. If what David Cameron was saying was true, that number would not be continuing to go up. The fact that it's going up means that they're being disingenuous to give it the most positive spin I possibly can.
Now, what does everybody think, by the way? We've had a kind of debt jubilee in the past week. Iceland has announced they fulfilled their election promise of actually writing off up to 13% of the mortgage debt on these debts that the banks themselves went under. The banks themselves were lending crookedly, fraudulent loans. So is that something that you see happening this next time? Obviously, it looks like the powers that be, the IMF and that paper, they're getting ready for a bail-in. They're going to take your savings, your pensions, whatever. Would you, Simon, I know you're a saver, would you prefer a bail-in or a debt jubilee?
I think what I'd prefer is the return to the Victorian idea of debtors' prisons, starting with the man responsible for the largest debt of all going in and not being able to come out since he's raised enough money from the public to free him. I mean, there is no good option. I mean, the trouble is, you know, in some way, this debt has to be forgiven or assuaged or something, and yet I just know it's always going to rebound on the savers. I mean, the savers have been the ones who've been stiffed for the last 5 years. They're the ones who've done what they were always told was the right thing to do, and it just gets my goat. I mean, we tried having a protest outside the Bank of England a year or two ago, though I realize actually arranging protests in the middle of winter is not always the most sensible idea, particularly given that the people who can come often are the people who are retired, and, you know, pensioners standing outside the Bank of England in sort of zero temperatures, not a great idea. I think I'm going to try it again next spring, because I think people are so much angrier than they were 2-3 years ago. There's no good option from the point of view of the saver. We're going to get stiffed whatever happens, I'm afraid to say.
But aren't you fighting the battle of these rising house prices? But at some point there's going to be a tipping point, right? Because a lot of, like, the new build, is up to 70% is bought by overseas owners, so it's not even like it's locals. No,
it's a very different picture outside London, of course. I mean, London is where most of the foreign buying is going. Yeah, I don't want to, you know, if the problem is that house prices are going up because there aren't enough homes being built, to any rational person the answer would be, let's build more homes so more people can live in them. But that, of course, is not the solution the UK government comes up with. Let's find ways of forcing more debt down their gullets so the prices go up. It's absolutely asinine. But as you pointed out earlier, the problem is that, you know, savers and people with pensions, they are the people who actually have the money at the moment, and so the chances are, if they're going after anybody, that's who they're going to go after. Now, Jan and her generation, if they are people who live on debt all the time, there's not much that can get taken from them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I guess I'm going to ask some of the more philosophical questions. You're getting a number of people writing in philosophical questions of where life came from. And LeBron for the win. We'll have it. This is an amusing little aside here. WTF is space? How fast is it? Where the F did space come from? Where did all these galaxies come from? When you think about space for a minute, it just dazzles you to realize that Earth does not mean shit to space. Well, then, nor do our debts.
Is that for me?
Obviously. LeBron for the win wants to know.
Well, LeBron for the win. I've been giving this some thought myself recently. I believe, as many scientists do, that the universe originated in something called the Big Bang, where all the matter and energy in the universe at one point was clustered in a pinprick of size and energy of infinite mass and weight, and then you had what's called the Big Bang, and the universe came into being. Now apply that same theory to Bitcoin for a second, because 4 years ago there was the Bitcoin protocol, which had no tangible value. No, it had only an ethereal value of a concept. Where did it come from? Did it come from Satoshi Nakamoto? Who is Satoshi? Is he from a parallel universe? Is he from the future? And he bequeathed the Bitcoin protocol onto our computer systems, and here we are 4 years later, and it's pushing $14–15 billion in market cap, heading for, according to Merrill Lynch, a multiple of silver, which would mean $30, $50, $60 billion. The Winklevoss think it could get to $400 billion. That came from a pinprick of computer algorithms 4 years ago that had a absolute non-presence anywhere in history, and it's similar to the Big Bang. That's why I consider Bitcoin to be the second Big Bang, and in many ways the second coming of the most spiritual experience ever experienced. That's why I am a big believer in this.
Can I maybe just bring that bit more back down to earth? And there was quite an interesting point that was made. I think it was on the Facebook page for this Hangout. There were some questions going on for it, and someone made a really nice point, and I like this, that Bitcoin doesn't just have to be an Earth-based currency. It can be like an intergalactical currency. I really like that idea. And in terms of the question of WTF is space, In my little head, if anyone's seen the Men in Black film, where the universe is stored on a cat's the collar, that's kind of how I like to imagine how space is. That we're just like very, very small, just in this game of marbles that's being played by some much bigger beings and aliens who probably are trading it for Bitcoin as we speak.
And Simon, what is space? WTF is space?
It's making my head hurt. I have absolutely no idea. I think if we start thinking about things like that, we're almost letting the central bankers and the politicians off the hook. And as soon as there's a way of sending people out into space as a sort of form of transportation, like sending people to Australia in the old days on penal colonies, penal spaceships, I certainly know who I'd like to put on the first one.
Well, actually, that's Bitcoin is a transportation system.
We could pay in Bitcoin for the Virgin flights to send the central bankers to space.
Well,
I think this is a good move.
I was thinking.
Well, if people who bought Bitcoin right at the beginning can probably now afford their own space effort, I'd have thought.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the people, the technology now, especially in Google, they're talking about uploading essentially your DNA and your digital presence into cyberspace as a way to achieve some form of immortality. And if that's the case, then Bitcoin is the perfect currency for the afterlife. And the old saying was you can't take it with you, but with Bitcoin you can take it with you. You can. Mandela could be spending Bitcoin right now.
Actually, that question, Jan, that you saw was from Morgan Rockwell on our Google Plus page, and he asked, when can we prove that we can send Bitcoin payment to an astronaut in the space station or on the moon or Mars? It is rest, not a global currency. It's not just a global currency. It's something that could work throughout the galaxy. There is a patent application. It's either from Amazon or PayPal for intergalactic payment system.
Well, I came up with the lunar dollar, 20 years ago, which is a currency based entirely on time, and it was a story about futures traders going backwards and forwards through time by trading time futures.
Well, I think with that, the time has run out on this.
Not on my platform. I'm going to continue into the past.
So that was it. And Jan Scoyles, this is Jan Scoyles. Why don't you tell everybody your website where they can find more information out about you?
You can find me on therealasset.co.uk, and I'm also on Twitter, which is Scoylesy, which is my Scoyles with just a Y at the end.
Scoylesy.
And can I say hello to Ned Naylor Leyland, because he's watching and he's been emailing me the whole time, and he was saying you would have been an idiot to put your money in a UK bank in the first place, and he wanted me to quote him on that. So hello, Ned.
Oh, he said you'd be an idiot to put your money in a UK bank?
In the first place. Yeah, let me just find the quote. He says you'd be nuts to put your money in a UK bank in the first place. So that's direct from Ned.
Okay, he's a smart guy. Simon, why don't you give details about where they can find you?
Well, I'm with Save Our Savers. We're trying to fight the fight on behalf of savers and pensioners, so come and join us. Our website is saveoursavers.co.uk. Completely free to come and join us, and we will try and represent your interests as best we can.
Awesome. And this is Max Keiser of the Keiser Report, and I'm Stacy Herbert of the Keiser Report. And this has been fun. Thank you for all your questions, and good luck with your Bitcoin, silver, gold, China, your new journey into outer space.
Bye, y'all. Bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
Our friends and our guests, Simon Rose of Save Our Savers, and Jan Scoyles of the Real Asset Company.
What about Plucky the rubber chicken?
You're responsible for him. You're supposed to bring him.
I know. He was a great hit at Kilkenomics this year, and Plucky has become a bit of a diva.
I see Simon has something with him.
What's this? Who's that?
A little monkey.
Simon has a little monkey with him, so you might meet him. Now, we've asked on maxkeiser.com, on Twitter, on RT's Google Plus page, on our Facebook page, and there's only one Keiser Report Facebook page. It's the official one. It's official. And we've asked the questions, and of course, guess what the number one question was? What topic was number one, Max?
Is it about Plucky?
No, it was about Bitcoin. Everybody wants to know about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, so I know, Jan, you've been writing about that on the Real Asset Company blog, and I hope, Simon, you might have an opinion about this as well. So let's ask the first question, because it's a very broad question about cryptocurrencies, and it's a good one to introduce everybody to the topic. So this is from Joseph Thompson, and he asked on RT's Google Plus page, he said, "Hey, Max and Stacy, keep up the great work. What part of cryptocurrencies do you find most fascinating? The social aspect, monetary aspect, etc. And secondly, Max, who is the first player you will buy when you take over Sheffield Wednesday Football Club?"
Oh, right. Well, is that for me?
Yeah, so which aspect of cryptocurrencies do you find most interesting? The monetary, fiscal, payment system, social aspect, what?
I think the social aspect, because it reminds me of when Napster started to go to war with the copyright cartel. And there's been an ongoing war between the copyright cartel and the lobbyists there, like the MPAA and the RIAA. And now we've got a currency going about the same path, using the same technology, and this time they're going after the Federal Reserve Bank system. And even now they're also merging with sites like Pirate Bay, are merging with cryptocurrencies.
I mean, obviously, representing a body of savers, we're appalled at the way the central bankers debase our currencies all the time. So any alternative which takes the power away from central bankers has to be admirable. The problem I have is that, as you tweeted the other day, Jan, I'm one of the guys who's terribly envious, because after listening to you a while ago, I spent a whole evening trying to buy some bitcoins and getting into it, and I just failed completely. I need to do it again, quite clearly, at some stage. But I just found it, I'm not completely stupid as a techie, but I just found it completely beyond me, and I fell at the last hurdle after arranging to buy some, because my bank wouldn't then let me transfer the money for several days, which of course defeated the object.
Yeah, that's actually a big problem we see at the moment, is people are sort of irrational with envy and rage about this, about how much the price has gone up. Now, Max, do you think this is a problem, though? Some people, like Hugh Hendry, a very well-known hedge fund manager here in the UK, has just come out and said it could be $1 million per Bitcoin. Merrill Lynch, remarkably, a top tech commentator there, top analyst at Merrill Lynch, just came out on Friday and said that Bitcoin is legitimate. It's going to displace Western Union. And he also brought up silver, which I think he probably got from us, is he compares it to silver, and that if it gains the legitimacy of silver, then it's surely at $1,300 is a fair value, he said. But what do you think about the price and what this means? And a lot of people say, oh, it's too expensive to buy.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, on CoinDesk, which is a good site that covers Bitcoin, they had a story today about a company here in the UK called ZipZap, which will have, through 28,000 outlets around the UK, the ability to go in and get Bitcoin, swap your pounds for Bitcoin. So it'll be a very retail product. I think that's what people miss about Bitcoin right now, is that you have to go back to 1994 and where the internet was back in 1994. A lot of people didn't think that the internet had any practical value. A lot of people found it too difficult to surf the internet. And this is very interesting to me on the social level. That's what I love about Bitcoin.
Okay, so then let's go to Jan Scoyles of the Real Asset Company, because Jan, you've been writing about Bitcoin for a while, one of the first of the gold and silver sort of sites that have been discussing Bitcoin. So what is the most fascinating to you observing as a person involved in gold and silver? What interests you most about Bitcoin?
I think that I agree with Max, the more social side of things that are going on at the moment. They, like Max was talking about Napster, I think also in this move sort of outside of the global financial crisis, we see more businesses being set up, which, peer-to-peer businesses and people interacting outside of this organized system, whether it's the banking system, whether it's insurance, different exchanges are being set up, very similar sites like Airbnb. It's all to do with the social side of things, and I think that's where Bitcoin is why Bitcoin's doing very well, because we've realised that now the internet has facilitated us to do things peer-to-peer rather than going through the sort of upper external body, as it were. I like it from someone that's into sound money and interested in gold and silver, because again, gold and silver are faceless currencies. They can't be reproduced by a central bank, and again we're seeing that with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And I think I also like it because, in the words of a very famous commentator in this space, you should be your own central bank and you should dictate how you're going to save and hold your money, and Bitcoin is just another way of protesting against how central banks are behaving, and that's why I'm interested in it. And I've said this many times, I think I've said it on Max's program as well. What someone once said to me when I first got involved in this space, I don't know what the right money is, but whichever one is the right money is the one that the people chose. And if that's happening with cryptocurrencies, it's happening with gold, if it's happening with silver, then, job done. They're saying what they want money to be, and that's why it interests me at the moment.
Okay, and we'll ask Simon, and just keep on that idea for a moment there, Jen, because other people were asking, there seem to be so many cryptocurrencies emerging, so which one do you think will survive? I think you kind of answered that, but let's go over to Simon.
Well, I'm fascinated, but mainly as an observer.
It was not really that well understood or that well used, and then Netscape came along. It became a browser that was quite easy then to surf the web, and you have the enormous growth in what we now know as the internet. So Bitcoin is kind of in that 1994, 1995 period. A couple of companies and applications are coming along that will make it very easy to use, and people can get Bitcoin quite easily. The price continues to go higher. The Merrill Lynch comment, I think, is interesting because Bitcoin is generating a lot of content and a lot of interest. So firms like Merrill Lynch or business outlets in the media like Business Insider, for example, that had a huge reversal. 2 weeks ago they were completely anti-Bitcoin. Now they're fanatically supporting Bitcoin because there's a huge amount of traffic being generated both on the content side and on the monetary side, and Merrill Lynch or Business Insider cannot afford not to have a piece of that traffic. Same thing with Hugh Hendry. He cannot afford not to be in Bitcoin or think about Bitcoin and still be competitive.
And Jen, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think it's interesting at the moment, people that, first of all, I'd quite like to go back to that envy thing, because I think that was quite interesting, because we saw that particularly with gold, a lot of people getting very angry about gold, and that was heading towards 1900. And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's clearly, it's worthless, and they were just angry about missing out on it. Well, I think we're seeing the same with Bitcoin, but you can't deny that more and more these huge industries, the banking industry, the governments, they're all coming out having to make comments on it, and it's because, like Max says, they can't afford to not be commenting on it, they can't afford to not be paying attention to it. We've now, China this week was the other big news, and they were having to respond to it as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more and what that means for Bitcoin. But certainly we're seeing, and the more people that are demanding to pay for things in Bitcoin, it can't be ignored. You can't ignore this conversation that's going on. And again, it comes down to this peer-to-peer thing. If we're talking to one another and we can make it happen without these people, then they either start listening to us or, they don't get to play the game, And I think Simon's got something he wants to say.
Well, I really want to ask you all a question. I mean, the big worry when you look back at what happened to gold in 1931, confiscation by the American government, is when the authorities finally get worried about Bitcoin, as clearly they must be sooner or later, how safe is it from any appropriation by the authorities?
Well, we've been asked this a lot lately. A few things, of course, the authorities don't like BitTorrents, but you can get any single movie, any single television show right now on Pirate Bay, which they are unable to shut down. And if they can't shut down these BitTorrents, this is the thing, it's peer-to-peer, it's crypto, and it's a lot of money. So you're asking, I think it's the equivalent of like when Mubarak tried to turn off the internet in Egypt, and it only lasted a few days before even all his thug buddies who ran corporations and the businesses, they demanded that it have to be turned back on because their businesses collapsed. So they want a piece of...
So this really is sticking it to the man.
Yeah. What do you think, Max?
No, I think the BitTorrent is a good analogy, and Pirate Bay and the BitTorrent infrastructure and ecosystem continues really despite all the efforts of governments and lobbyists. And the Bitcoin strengthens both BitTorrent and Pirate Bay, which in turn strengthens Bitcoin, because a lot of people say, what am I going to spend my Bitcoin on? Well, more and more it's going to be on micropayments for things like BitTorrents and other sites. Or we saw an application in the journalism space and the political space with the Julian Assange case. Of course, when people try to give Julian Assange some money, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard created a financial blockade. Bitcoin was the only way to get money into the WikiLeaks and to support Julian Assange. So again, there's this huge network of folks all over the world. So any one country or a few companies may take an anti-Bitcoin position, but they're never going to equal the global support of Bitcoin. And as the global support continues in places like Africa, Asia, India, there's no single entity, whether it's a corporation or a country,